For 30 years, Beatrice dedicated her life to caring for the children of a wealthy family, never imagining that one of them was her own son, stolen from her arms as a baby. What seemed like an ordinary job concealed a devastating secret, buried by time and by a powerful family willing to do anything to keep the truth hidden. But destiny never lets secrets stay buried forever. When an unexpected confession and long-lost documents resurface, the truth detonates like a bomb. Now, mother and son face an impossible choice: continue living the lie they know or embrace the truth that will change everything forever. The rain drizzled lightly that gray morning, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the small restaurant. Thomas, a successful businessman, absent-mindedly flipped through a newspaper while waiting for his order. Quick and silent lunches were part of his routine. He never paid attention to his surroundings, but today was different. His eyes landed on a familiar figure, a woman with graying hair, moving calmly as she wiped down tables. A chill ran down his spine. Something about her unsettled him, though he couldn't say why. She, in turn, noticed his gaze and quickly looked away, as if trying to avoid any interaction. But it was too late. Thomas felt his heart pound. There was something in her face that stirred an unfamiliar yet undeniable discomfort within him, a memory lingering just out of reach. He tried to shake off the feeling, just another employee, nothing more. But then she smiled at a child sitting nearby, and his stomach clenched. That smile, he had seen it before. But where? Restless, he called the waiter. "Who is that woman?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The young man glanced at her and replied nonchalantly, "Oh, that's Miss Beatrice. She's been working here for years. She has a big heart. Everyone loves her." The name echoed in his mind like a distant whisper, sending a strange sensation through his chest. Thomas frowned. Why did that name feel so familiar? Why was his body reacting as if something was wrong? Without thinking, he stood up. He wasn't one to act impulsively, but in that moment, he felt he had no choice. He walked toward Beatrice, who was gathering dishes, and stopped beside her. "Excuse me." His voice wavered slightly, almost trembling. "Do I know you?" Beatrice froze. The plate in her hands trembled slightly. She hesitated for a second before looking up. When she finally did, her eyes were glistening. "Maybe," she whispered, her voice carrying something far heavier than uncertainty. For a brief moment, the restaurant disappeared. The clinking of silverware and murmured conversations faded into a distant hum. All that remained was a dense, suffocating silence between them. Beatrice blinked a few times, as if battling an inner storm. "You don't remember me, do you?" Her tone was a fragile blend of sadness and hope. A tight knot formed in Thomas's throat. How could he remember? Who was this woman? And why did he feel, deep in his soul, that this simple question was about to change his life forever? The moment lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken, as if time itself had slowed. Thomas tried to form words, but his mind was blank. Beatrice, standing before him, was no longer just a stranger. She was a ghost from a past he didn't even remember. "Should I?" he finally asked, his voice quieter now, almost as if he feared the answer. Beatrice let out a deep breath, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for something. Some trace of recognition, some forgotten flicker of the boy she once knew. "Maybe not," she admitted with a faint, almost melancholic smile. "But I remember you, Thomas." The certainty in her tone sent a chill down his spine. His heartbeat drummed in his ears as confusion tangled with something deeper, something he couldn't name. He clenched his jaw, suddenly aware of how unsteady his breathing had become. The weight of her words pressed against him, stirring an unease that clawed at the edges of his mind. "How do you know me?" he asked, his voice strained. Beatrice hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of a cloth napkin, as if holding onto something far more fragile. "I've known you your whole life," she finally said. Thomas scoffed, a nervous chuckle escaping before he could stop it. "That's impossible," he muttered, shaking his head. "I grew up with my family, my parents." But even as he spoke, a strange sensation curled in his stomach, like a puzzle piece that had been missing, now trying to force itself into place. You grew up with them, yes, Beatrice said gently. But they are not your parents. The world tilted. The restaurant around him blurred into meaningless noise. Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him, his grip tightening on the back of the chair beside him. Excuse me? His voice was barely above a whisper. Beatrice watched him with a patience that made it clear. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a truth waiting to be spoken. He wanted to laugh, to tell her she was insane, but something about the way she stood there, so calm, so certain, made that impossible. Instead, all he could do was stare. That's not true, he finally said. But the words tasted strange in his mouth. It can't be. Beatrice simply looked at him, her silence heavier than any argument she could have made. Thomas swallowed hard, his pulse hammering. His world had always been so carefully structured, logical, stable, and yet, with just a few words, this woman had sent cracks running through the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Then prove me wrong, Beatrice finally said, her voice quiet but unwavering. Her challenge hung in the air between them, daring him to pull at the thread that might unravel everything. And in that moment, Thomas realized something terrifying. He wasn't sure if he wanted to. Thomas paced the length of his apartment, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The weight of Beatrice's words refused to fade, pressing against him like an unseen force. He pulled out an old photo album from his bookshelf, one he hadn't touched in years. His fingers trembled as he flipped through childhood memories, searching for something, anything, that might prove her wrong. But the more he looked, the more he noticed the inconsistencies. The lack of baby pictures before a certain age, the distance in his parents' smiles. A growing pit formed in his stomach. His phone vibrated on the coffee table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was his mother. He hesitated before answering, his voice strained. "Hey, Mom," he said, forcing normalcy into his tone. "Quick question. Do you have any pictures of me as a newborn?" Silence. Then a carefully measured response. "Of course, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" He could hear it, the hesitation, the unspoken fear. His heart pounded. "No reason," he lied. "Just curious." But in that moment, he knew. Beatrice had planted a seed of doubt, and it was growing at an alarming rate. He had always trusted his parents without question, but now every childhood memory felt like a carefully curated story. He needed answers, and the only person who seemed willing to give them was the woman who had just shattered his reality. Against his better judgment, he found himself dialing her number. The phone rang once, twice, then a soft voice answered. "Thomas," she said, as if she had been expecting his call. "I need to see you," he blurted out, running a hand through his hair. Now, there was no hesitation. "I'm at the park on Westfield," she said. "Come." He barely registered, grabbing his coat before heading out the door. The cold air hit him like a slap, but he welcomed it. He needed something to ground him, to keep him from spiraling. As he approached the park, he spotted her sitting on a bench, hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked up as he neared, her eyes filled with something he couldn't name. "Tell me everything," he demanded, his voice barely steady. She nodded, patting the space beside her. "It's a long story," she admitted, "and it won't be easy to hear." Thomas clenched his fists, bracing himself. "I don't care," he said. "I need to know." And with that, the first thread of his past began to unravel, one painful truth at a time. The moment Beatrice began speaking, Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him. Her voice was steady but heavy with years of unspoken pain. "You were taken from me, Thomas. Stolen," she whispered, her fingers clenching the fabric of her coat. He inhaled sharply, his chest tightening as if an invisible force had seized his lungs. "Stolen?" The word rattled in his mind, clashing violently with the life he thought he knew. "That's impossible," he muttered. But even as he spoke, doubt slithered through his thoughts, coiling around every childhood memory. Beatrice reached into her purse, pulling out an old, creased photograph. She handed it to him with trembling hands. "This was taken the day before they took you from me," she said softly. Thomas stared at the image. A younger Beatrice holding a baby, her face radiant with love. His stomach twisted. The child in her arms had his eyes, his dimples, him. His mind screamed for an explanation, for logic to override the impossible. "No," he said, shaking his head. "My parents, they wouldn't lie to me. They couldn't." But the look in Beatrice's eyes said otherwise. She pulled out a second item, a birth certificate. His real birth certificate. The name printed wasn't the one he had always known. The parents listed weren't the ones who had raised him. Thomas's pulse roared in his ears. His fingers clenched the paper so tightly it threatened to tear. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was proof. A cold wave of nausea crashed over him as reality began to take shape. His entire life, his identity, had been built on a lie. His mind spiraled through the years, searching for signs he had ignored. The way his mother always changed the subject when he asked about his early years. The lack of baby pictures. The subtle moments of tension whenever adoption or birth stories were mentioned. Had he been blind this whole time? His breath came out in ragged gasps as he shot to his feet. "Who did this?" he demanded. "Why?" Beatrice's face twisted in pain. "The people who raised you. They weren't meant to be your parents," she whispered. "They were meant to keep you away from me." Thomas stumbled back, the world tilting beneath him. This was more than just a stolen past. This was a calculated deception. A conspiracy that had shaped his entire existence. And now, he was faced with a choice. Accept the life he had always known, or step into the storm of truth and uncover everything that had been hidden from him. His heart pounded as he looked at Beatrice. "I need to know everything," he said, his voice raw. She nodded, eyes filled with sorrow. "Then prepare yourself, my son. The truth is only beginning." Thomas's mind swirled with a tempest of emotions. Anger, confusion, and a deep, gut-wrenching sense of betrayal. Every memory he had with his parents now felt tainted, stained by the possibility that their love had been built on a lie. How could they look him in the eyes, celebrate his birthdays, watch him grow, and never once tell him the truth? His chest tightened as he clutched the old birth certificate. It felt like a foreign object in his hands, something that should never have existed. Yet it was proof of a reality he could no longer ignore. Beatrice watched him carefully, her eyes filled with both sorrow and hope. "I know this is overwhelming," she said softly, "but you deserve to know the truth, no matter how painful it is." Thomas's gaze snapped to hers, a storm raging behind his eyes. "Why now?" he demanded. "Why did you wait all these years to find me?" The moment the question left his lips, guilt settled deep in his bones. He didn't want to blame her, but the weight of the situation was suffocating. He needed answers. He needed something to anchor him before he drowned in uncertainty. She inhaled shakily, glancing down as if searching for strength. "I searched for you, Thomas, every day, but they made sure you were unreachable." Her voice cracked, and she wiped a stray tear away. "They were powerful, connected. I was just a maid. No one would listen to me. They told me you had died." The words struck Thomas like a physical blow. His heart pounded in his chest, fury igniting in his veins. "They let you believe I was dead?" His hands curled into fists. Who did this to us?" Beatrice hesitated, then uttered a name that made Thomas's blood run cold. His father, the man who had raised him, taught him right from wrong, shaped him into the man he was today. His breath caught in his throat, his vision blurring. "No, that's not possible," he whispered, but deep down a buried instinct told him otherwise. The controlling nature, the secrets, the way his father always dodged questions about his early years. It had all been there, he had just never seen it. Or perhaps he had never wanted to. His body trembled with the force of his emotions, torn between the man who had raised him and the mother who had fought for him in the shadows. What did that make him? A stolen son? A child of deception? He wanted to run, to escape this unbearable truth. But there was no escaping it now. His life as he had known it was over. The next step was his to take. As he met Beatrice's gaze, his voice wavered, but his resolve was firm. "I need to confront him." Beatrice's face paled. "Thomas, This truth is dangerous. You don't know what they're capable of." But he shook his head, jaw clenched. "If my life was built on a lie, then I need to hear it from him." His world was already falling apart. There was no turning back now. Only forward into the storm. MCS. Thomas stood at the doorstep of his childhood home, his pulse hammering in his ears. The grand estate, once a place of warmth and comfort, now loomed before him like a prison of carefully constructed deceit. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, but the weight of betrayal pressed heavy on his chest. The door, polished and pristine, felt like a barrier between him and the truth. He wasn't just knocking on a door, he was breaking through decades of secrets. His fingers curled into a fist, and with one firm motion, he rapped against the wood, each knock carrying the force of his unspoken rage. When the door swung open, his father stood there, a familiar figure dressed in an expensive suit, his face calm, too calm. "Thomas," he greeted, as if this were any other day. But Thomas wasn't here for pleasantries. His grip tightened on the crumpled birth certificate in his pocket. "We need to talk," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. His father's gaze flickered, just for a second, before he stepped aside, allowing him in. The house smelled the same. Polished wood, expensive cologne, but now it reeked of deception. They sat in the lavish study, bookshelves filled with knowledge that suddenly felt meaningless. Thomas didn't waste time. He placed the birth certificate on the desk between them, watching his father's face for any sign of guilt. "Explain this," he demanded. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. His father exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "I did what was necessary," he finally said. The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. Not an apology, not even a denial, just cold justification. Thomas shot up from his chair, fury erupting from the depths of his soul. "You stole me from her," he spat. "You let her believe I was dead. And for what? Money? Power?" His father remained seated, his fingers interlocked, his calm demeanor unwavering. "You wouldn't understand," he replied. "I gave you a life she never could. You had everything, education, security, a future." The audacity sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. He had been nothing but a possession, a pawn in a grander scheme. He wanted to scream, to break something, but he forced himself to breathe. "You had no right," he hissed. "She's my mother." His father's jaw clenched for the first time. "She was the past. I am your future." The arrogance in his voice made Thomas's blood boil. He wasn't a child anymore, blinded by love and admiration. He saw his father for what he truly was, a man willing to rewrite destiny to serve his own interests. And that realization shattered whatever lingering respect he had left. His hands trembled as he stepped back, shaking his head. "I don't owe you anything," he declared. "Not after this." His father's lips pressed into a thin line. "If you walk away from this family, you walk away from everything." A final attempt at control, at manipulation. But Thomas met his gaze, unwavering. Then so be it. His father had built an empire on lies, but Thomas refused to let those same lies define his future. He turned, walking toward the door, heart pounding with every step. As he reached for the handle, his father spoke once more. "She won't give you the life I did." Thomas paused, but he didn't turn back. "Maybe not," he said, voice steady, "but at least she gave me the truth." With that, he stepped out, leaving behind the only life he had ever known. For the first time, he was free, but freedom came with a price, and the cost of truth had never been higher. Thomas stepped onto the dimly lit sidewalk, the weight of the confrontation still pressing on his chest. The estate, once a symbol of his identity, now felt like a mausoleum of lies and manipulation. His heart pounded as he tried to steady his breath, but his world had shifted irreversibly. He had walked away from power, from wealth, from the only life he ever knew. But in doing so, he had reclaimed something far more valuable, his truth. He pulled his phone from his pocket, hesitating before dialing the number that would change everything. On the other end of the city, Beatrice sat in her small, modest home, staring at the clock on the wall. She had spent years imagining this moment, but now that it was here, she was paralyzed with fear. Would he hate her? Would he resent her for never finding him sooner? The past had stolen her son, but she was terrified the present would not return him. Then the phone rang. Her breath hitched as she saw the unknown number. With trembling hands, she answered. "Hello." The silence stretched. Then, a voice, uncertain, raw, and filled with emotion. "Is it true?" Tears welled in her eyes. How do you tell a child, no, a grown man, that his entire life was built on a stolen foundation? "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's true." On the other end, Thomas exhaled, a mix of relief and devastation flooding his system. The truth had always been there, buried beneath layers of deception, but now it stood before him, undeniable. He wanted to scream, cry, maybe even laugh at the absurdity of it all. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. "Can I see you?" Beatrice's heart nearly stopped. She had spent 3 decades waiting for those words. "Of course," she managed, wiping away the silent tears that streamed down her face. "Whenever you're ready." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, the gravity of his decision settling in. "I'll be there soon," he said before hanging up. As he hailed a cab, his mind swirled with memories. Some real, some manufactured. The father who raised him had shaped his world with wealth and control, but the mother he had never known had loved him despite the distance. Which version of himself was real? The ride across town felt endless. As the city blurred past the window, Thomas wrestled with his emotions. He had always believed in control, order, success, the pillars his father had drilled into him. But now, for the first time, he felt untethered. Was he simply a man unraveling a mystery, or was he a son returning to where he truly belonged? His pulse quickened as the cab slowed in front of a modest brick house, far from the extravagant mansions he had grown up in. This was her home, his home. Stepping onto the pavement, Thomas felt like an imposter in his own story. The door creaked open before he even knocked, revealing Beatrice standing there, clutching the edge of the doorframe as if she needed it to stand. She was older than he expected, her face lined with years of sorrow and longing. But her eyes, they were his, not his father's, not his so-called family's. He swallowed the lump in his throat, unsure of what to say. "You're real," he finally murmured. And in that moment, Beatrice knew. No matter how much time had passed, she had finally found her son. The front door stood ajar, a silent invitation to a moment that had been 3 decades in the making. Thomas hesitated at the threshold, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. Was he really ready to step inside? The grand estates and polished marble floors of his past felt worlds away from this small, humble home. A scent of fresh bread and something vaguely familiar lingered in the air, stirring memories he couldn't quite place. He looked up, meeting Beatrice's gaze, nervous, expectant, and filled with something he hadn't seen in his adoptive parents' eyes. Unconditional love. Beatrice clenched her hands, willing herself to remain composed. She had imagined this day in countless ways, rehearsing words that now refused to form. Would he see her as a stranger, a threat, or worse, a mistake? "Come in," she finally said, stepping back. Her voice was softer than she intended, but Thomas heard the unspoken plea beneath it. He stepped inside cautiously, feeling like a trespasser in his own history. The walls were adorned with photos, children, grandkids, smiling faces he didn't recognize. But there, on a modest wooden shelf, was a single frame, a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. His throat tightened. That was him. The realization sent a shock through his system. Beatrice followed his gaze, her fingers twitching at her sides. "I never stopped looking for you," she whispered. "I never stopped loving you." The weight of her words settled heavily on him, conflicting with everything he had been taught. He had been raised to believe that love was measured in discipline, in expectations, in achievements. But this was something raw, something he didn't know how to accept. Had he been missing this his entire life? Silence stretched between them, thick with questions neither knew how to ask. What do you say to the mother you never knew? Thomas took a slow breath, his carefully composed demeanor fracturing. Why didn't they tell me? His voice was steadier than he felt, but Beatrice heard the pain beneath it. She lowered herself onto the couch, her hands trembling slightly. Because they wanted to erase me, she said simply. They stole you, Thomas. They stole my life with you. A chill ran down his spine. He had suspected the truth was dark, but hearing it aloud made it real. His entire existence had been shaped by a lie. He clenched his fists, trying to process the weight of it. So they knew. His voice was hoarse. Beatrice nodded, fresh tears glistening in her eyes. They knew, and they made sure you never did. The walls of certainty he had built over the years crumbled. His parents, the people he trusted, had knowingly kept him from the one person who had loved him first. The betrayal cut deeper than he thought possible. For the first time in his life, Thomas felt small, unmoored, as if he were staring into a mirror that no longer reflected the person he believed himself to be. Had he been living someone else's life all along? His gaze flickered to Beatrice, who sat across from him, waiting. Not demanding, not pleading, just waiting. And in that moment, he realized something startling. She wasn't the one who had to prove herself to him. He had to prove himself to her. A shaky exhale left his lips. He wasn't sure what came next. There was no roadmap for reconciling a past that had been stolen. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Maybe this wasn't just a meeting. Maybe it was the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for. The truth clung to Thomas like a heavy shroud, suffocating, unrelenting. He had spent his whole life believing in an illusion, and now, faced with the raw reality of his origins, he felt like a stranger in his own skin. His mind raced through fragmented memories. His childhood, the sterile warmth of his adoptive parents' home, the discipline disguised as love. Had every tender word, every moment of comfort, been built on a lie? Beatrice sat across from him, her hands clasped together, waiting for him to speak. But what could he say to a mother he had been trained to forget? Beatrice could see the storm brewing inside him, the war between disbelief and undeniable truth. She had spent years imagining this moment, rehearsing the words that would make him understand, make him believe. But as she looked at the son she had lost, she realized there was no perfect script, no magic phrase that could undo the damage of 30 years. I never wanted to give you up, she finally whispered, her voice barely above a breath. They told me you had died. The words felt like shattered glass in her throat, each syllable carrying decades of grief. Thomas flinched, his heart pounding in his chest. Died. His adoptive parents had told him he was an orphan, that his birth mother had been unfit, incapable of caring for him. But the pain in Beatrice's eyes was real, too raw to be anything but the truth. His fingers dug into his palms as the weight of betrayal settled over him like a suffocating fog. He had trusted them, believed them, but if Beatrice was telling the truth, then his entire existence had been orchestrated by deception. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. He needed space, air, a way to escape the crushing weight of what he had just learned. But as he moved to stand, Beatrice reached for his hand. He stiffened at the touch, every instinct screaming at him to pull away. But he didn't. Her grip was gentle, warm, a stark contrast to the cold, calculated world he had known. I don't expect you to forgive them, she murmured. I don't even expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know the truth. The vulnerability in her voice cracked something inside him. For the first time in his life, he saw her not as a stranger, not as an intruder in his carefully curated world, but as a mother who had been robbed of her child. His throat tightened. He had always prided himself on logic, on reason. But this wasn't something he could rationalize away. This was his life, his blood, his truth, and it had been stolen from him. He looked away, swallowing the knot in his throat. What did he do now? What did he do with the knowledge that the people who raised him had built his life on a foundation of lies? He had come here expecting to find closure, maybe even dismiss the rumors. But now, Faced with undeniable reality, he was drowning in uncertainty. Could he walk away from the only life he had ever known? Could he ignore the woman who had waited for him, suffered for him, loved him despite never getting the chance to hold him? A sharp inhale, a choice. He could turn his back, pretend none of this ever happened. Or he could step forward, into the unknown, into the truth that had been waiting for him all along. Beatriz didn't pressure him, didn't plead. She simply sat there, giving him the space to decide. And as the silence stretched between them, Thomas realized this wasn't just a confrontation. This was the beginning of something far greater. The realization settled over Thomas like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. Everything he had ever known, his childhood, his family, his very identity, was a carefully crafted illusion. He replayed every moment with his adoptive parents, searching for cracks in the facade, clues he had been too blind to see. Had they ever truly loved him, or had he simply been a pawn in their selfish game? The betrayal cut deep, leaving an ache that no amount of reasoning could soothe. Beatriz watched him carefully, recognizing the turmoil etched across his face. She had spent decades carrying the weight of this truth alone, but now it was his burden too. "I don't expect you to hate them," she said gently, though the pain in her voice was unmistakable. "But I need you to understand. I fought for you. I never stopped fighting." Her words were meant to offer solace, but they only deepened the chasm in his chest. How could he reconcile the mother who raised him with the mother who had been stolen from him? His mind raced with questions that had no easy answers. Had they ever planned to tell him the truth? Or had they expected him to live his entire life in blissful ignorance? The thought sickened him. Every holiday, every birthday, every whispered, "I love you." Were they just lies wrapped in pretty packaging? His fists clenched at his sides, the anger bubbling beneath the surface like a volcano ready to erupt. But anger wouldn't change the past. It wouldn't undo the damage that had already been done. Beatriz reached into a worn envelope, pulling out a faded photograph. A baby, swaddled in a pale blue blanket, tiny fingers curled around an unfamiliar hand. "This was the last time I held you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The night before they took you from me." Thomas hesitated before taking the photo, his eyes tracing every detail. It should have been impossible, but something inside him stirred, a recognition beyond logic. This wasn't just any child. This was him. The walls around his heart began to crack. For so long, he had believed his life was his own, untouched by tragedy. Now he saw the scars he had never noticed before, the restless longing, the feeling of being out of place, the void he had never been able to name. He hadn't been abandoned. He had been stolen. And that changed everything. His whole body tensed with the weight of it. What was he supposed to do with this truth? Beatriz didn't push for an answer. She knew this battle was his to fight. "I don't want to take anything from you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I just want you to know you were always wanted, always loved." The sincerity in her words shattered him. For the first time, the anger gave way to something else: grief, loss, longing. He had spent his whole life searching for a place to belong, and now, standing before the mother he never knew he had, he realized he had belonged to her all along. A deep breath, a moment of silence. Thomas had a choice. He could walk away, cling to the life he had known, and bury the truth in the shadows. Or he could face it, embrace it, and let it redefine him. The road ahead was uncertain, riddled with pain and unanswered questions. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't lost. He was standing at the edge of something terrifying yet beautiful. A chance to reclaim the love that had been stolen from him. The confrontation was inevitable. Thomas stood in the lavish living room of the family who had raised him, the air thick with tension. His adoptive parents sat across from him, their faces a mixture of concern and unease. They knew. They had always known. The weight of betrayal pressed down on his chest like an iron vice. He had come for answers, but as he looked into their familiar yet now unrecognizable eyes, he wondered, was he truly ready to hear the truth? Beatriz remained outside, waiting. This wasn't her battle to fight. She had spent years dreaming of this moment, of Thomas confronting the people who had stolen him from her arms. But now, she realized that reclaiming her son meant forcing him to tear apart the only world he had ever known. She had prayed for this day, but as she stood in the shadows, she prayed for something else. For him to find clarity, for him to find peace. Thomas's voice trembled, but he refused to waver. "Tell me the truth." He dropped the faded photograph onto the coffee table, the past staring back at them in black and white. His adoptive mother, Margaret, paled. His father, Charles, ran a hand through his graying hair. There was no way out now. No more lies. No more excuses. The silence stretched unbearably long before Margaret finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We never wanted to hurt you." Hurt. The word felt almost laughable. Thomas clenched his jaw, his patience wearing thin. "You stole me," he spat. "You let me believe I was abandoned when I was never meant to be yours." His voice cracked with emotion, his hands shaking. The room seemed smaller, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were pressing in, demanding the truth be spoken aloud. And then, at last, Charles exhaled, resigned. "We didn't steal you," he admitted. "We saved you." A cold, bitter laugh escaped Thomas's lips. "Saved me?" His hands balled into fists. "From what? From my own mother? From the love I was meant to have?" His words hit like daggers, and for the first time, guilt flickered in Margaret's tear-filled eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered. "There were things you didn't know. Things that, but Thomas had heard enough. There would always be excuses, always justifications, but no reason would ever erase the years lost, the love stolen. The weight of it all was unbearable." Thomas turned away, needing air, needing space. The room, the life he had once cherished, felt foreign now. He had spent his whole life trying to be the perfect son for them, never realizing he had belonged to someone else all along. He reached the door, pausing for a final moment. "I deserved the truth," he said, his voice steadier now, filled with a quiet strength. "And you took that from me." Then, without another word, he stepped outside, leaving the past behind. Beatrice was waiting, her eyes searching his. "Did they tell you what you needed to hear?" Thomas swallowed hard, his heart hammering in his chest. "No," he admitted, "but they told me enough." The world he had known had crumbled, but in its place, something new was beginning to take shape. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trapped between two worlds. He was finally choosing his own. Thomas had always thought of memories as something intangible, fragments of laughter, echoes of words, shadows of feelings. But now, standing in the small, dimly lit motel room he had rented for the night, he realized memories could be heavy. The past sat beside him like an unwanted guest, whispering in his ear, pulling him back to a life that no longer made sense. He held the old photograph in his hands, his fingers tracing the edges of a time he was never supposed to forget. Beatrice sat across from him, silent. She knew this moment wasn't hers to rush. She had dreamed of having her son back, but she never imagined the pain that would come with it. How do you comfort someone mourning a life that wasn't even theirs to begin with? She wanted to tell him it would be okay, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. But love alone wasn't enough to erase decades of deception. She could only wait. Thomas exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "I don't know who I am anymore." His voice cracked under the weight of his own admission. "Everything I built, everything I believed in, it was all based on a lie." He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts spiraling. Had his achievements ever truly been his? Or were they the results of a stolen identity, a carefully crafted illusion? He wanted to scream, to break something, to make sense of a world that had stopped making sense. Beatrice leaned forward, her voice soft but steady. "You are my son. That has never changed." Her words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a truth he was still struggling to accept. "You were taken from me, but you were never lost." "Not really." She reached out hesitantly, unsure if he would let her in. "And who you are, that's something only you get to decide." Her words lingered in the air, fighting against the storm inside him. Could he just erase the years he had spent as Thomas, the devoted son of Margaret and Charles? Could he suddenly become the boy Beatrice had lost, the child she had never stopped loving? Or was he someone entirely different? Someone still searching for his own name, his own truth? The answer didn't come easily, and maybe it never would. But for the first time, he realized he wasn't alone in finding it. The night stretched on, filled with quiet conversations and heavy silences. Beatrice told him stories of his childhood, of the lullabies she used to hum, of the small birthmark he had on his shoulder, the same one he had always wondered about. Slowly, piece by piece, a part of him he had never known began to surface. But acceptance didn't come without resistance, and neither of them knew what the morning would bring. As exhaustion settled in, Thomas closed his eyes, his mind still restless. He had spent his whole life believing he knew where he belonged. Now he wasn't sure of anything. But as he drifted into sleep, one thought remained. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was only the beginning. Beatrice had spent her life fighting battles in silence. She had fought against the loneliness of losing her child, against the injustice of a world that had stripped him away, and against the years of aching uncertainty. But now, staring at Thomas, she realized this was the hardest fight of all, the battle for her son's heart. She had to prove that love, no matter how long it had been buried, was still alive. Thomas watched Beatrice as she spoke, her voice steady yet filled with unspoken pain. She wasn't asking for his love, nor was she demanding forgiveness. She only wanted him to understand the truth. "They took you from me, Thomas," she said, her fingers gripping the chair as if holding on to something real. "I searched for you. I begged for answers. But they made sure I would never find you." The weight of her words settled deep in his chest. He had spent his life admiring the family that raised him, believing in their kindness, their generosity. But now, doubt seeped into every memory. Had they truly loved him? Or had he just been a pawn in their carefully constructed lie? He wanted to deny it, to reject the idea that his whole life had been built on a crime. But Beatrice's eyes held nothing but truth. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for an old, faded document, a birth certificate with his real name. "You were never theirs, Thomas," she whispered. "You were mine." The words shattered something inside him. He wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that he hadn't asked for this truth, that he didn't know how to exist in a world where his entire past had been rewritten. Beatrice saw the storm in his eyes and softened. "I don't expect you to love me just because I'm your mother," she said. "But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you." Her voice broke slightly, her vulnerability exposed. "And I will fight for you, even if it takes the rest of my life." Thomas swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it impossible to speak. No one had ever fought for him like this before, not in a way that wasn't tied to obligation or expectation. Beatrice wasn't trying to win him over with grand gestures or desperate pleas. She was simply showing him the truth and giving him the choice of what to do with it. For the first time since discovering the secret that changed everything, Thomas realized he had the power to decide his own future. And that was more terrifying than any lie he had ever lived. Thomas stood at the edge of the truth, staring down into the abyss of his past. His entire life had been shaped by a lie, and now the weight of that deception threatened to crush him. He wanted to run, to escape the suffocating reality pressing against his chest. But Beatrice's eyes, filled with a love so raw and unshaken, held him in place. He wasn't a child anymore, but at that moment he felt utterly lost. His adoptive parents, the people he had trusted without question, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. The home he had once felt safe in was now tainted with stolen love, stolen identity, stolen time. How could he look at them and not see the hands that had torn him away from his real mother? How could he face them knowing they had rewritten his history for their own benefit? A mix of grief and fury burned in his chest, demanding release. Beatrice saw the war raging inside him. She longed to reach out, to comfort him, but she knew this was a battle he had to fight alone. He needed space to process, to grieve the life he thought he knew. So she stood quietly, giving him the freedom to feel everything without judgment. That was what a mother did. She didn't force, she didn't demand. She simply waited with open arms for when he was ready. The confrontation was inevitable. Thomas had to hear their side of the story. He needed to know why they had taken him, why they had hidden the truth for so long, and whether they had ever truly loved him or just the idea of keeping him. Every answer felt like a double-edged sword, each one capable of cutting him deeper. And yet, he had no choice but to face it. When he finally stood before them, his heart pounded so violently that he thought it might shatter inside his chest. His adoptive mother, Evelyn, flinched at the pain in his eyes. His adoptive father, Richard, held his breath, knowing the moment they had feared had arrived. "Tell me the truth," Thomas demanded, his voice cold and shaking. "Did you ever love me? Or was I just a stolen prize?" Silence. A thick, unbearable silence. And then, Evelyn broke down, tears streaming as she whispered, "We did love you, Thomas. But we were too afraid of losing you." Richard, however, remained rigid, his guilt manifesting as anger. "We gave you a better life," he snapped. "One she never could have given you." The words cut through Thomas like a blade, igniting the rage he had tried to suppress. "You had no right," he roared. "No right to decide who I was meant to be." This was the breaking point, the moment where everything shattered. The family he thought he had, the love he once believed in, the trust he had blindly given. It was all gone. The room felt too small, too suffocating. And as he turned his back on them, stepping away from the only life he had ever known, he realized that sometimes the only way to find the truth was to burn everything else down. Thomas stormed out of the house, his heart pounding, his mind spiraling into chaos. The air outside was crisp, but it did nothing to cool the fire raging inside him. Every step away from the people who raised him felt like shedding a layer of his past. They had stolen his life, rewritten his story, and now he was left with nothing but shattered trust and an identity he didn't recognize. The boy they had raised was gone. What remained was a man desperate to reclaim himself. Beatrice followed him, but she kept her distance. She knew the storm inside him needed space to unravel. For so long, she had dreamt of this moment, of holding him, of making up for lost time. But now, she saw the weight of reality crushing him. He wasn't ready. He had just lost the foundation of his world, and no matter how much she longed to comfort him, she couldn't force his heart to accept what his mind wasn't prepared to process. Thomas clenched his fists, his breath uneven. How could love and betrayal exist in the same space? He had memories of warmth, of bedtime stories, of birthday celebrations. But now, every single one felt tainted. Had any of it been real? Or was it all just a performance, a way to keep him from questioning too much? His childhood had been a lie. His parents had been thieves. And his past had been rewritten to suit their needs. Beatrice finally spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. "I know this hurts, Thomas. More than anything, I wish I could take away this pain." He turned to her, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "Then why did you wait?" he demanded. "Why didn't you come for me sooner?" The accusation stung, but she took it without flinching. "I tried," she whispered, "but they were powerful, and I was just a desperate mother no one would believe." Her words felt like a punch to his gut. For years, he had unknowingly lived a life built on her suffering. She had fought for him, cried for him, but the world had refused to listen. He had been lost, but she had been left behind. Yearning for a child she never stopped loving. The weight of her pain settled over him, suffocating yet grounding. She wasn't just his mother. She was a survivor of the same betrayal that had broken him. He wanted to run, to disappear into the night and escape the overwhelming truth. But as he looked into Beatrice's eyes, he saw something he had never seen before. Unconditional love, unshaken by time, unbroken by distance. The kind of love that didn't demand anything in return. The kind of love he had never questioned until now. He had been robbed of years with her, but standing here, he realized that he had a choice. Continue running from the truth or start rebuilding from the ruins. Taking a deep breath, he looked at her, not as a stranger, not as a ghost from his past, but as his mother. The pain wouldn't fade overnight, and the anger wouldn't disappear in an instant. But for the first time since the truth was revealed, he allowed himself to take one hesitant step toward the woman who had never stopped waiting for him. Thomas stormed out of the house, his heart pounding, his mind spiraling into chaos. The air outside was crisp, but it did nothing to cool the fire raging inside him. Every step away from the people who raised him felt like shedding a layer of his past. They had stolen his life, rewritten his story, and now he was left with nothing but shattered trust and an identity he didn't recognize. The boy they had raised was gone. What remained was a man desperate to reclaim himself. Beatrice followed him, but she kept her distance. She knew the storm inside him needed space to unravel. For so long, she had dreamt of this moment, of holding him, of making up for lost time. But now, she saw the weight of reality crushing him. He wasn't ready. He had just lost the foundation of his world, and no matter how much she longed to comfort him, she couldn't force his heart to accept what his mind wasn't prepared to process. Thomas clenched his fists, his breath uneven. How could love and betrayal exist in the same space? He had memories of warmth, of bedtime stories, of birthday celebrations. But now, every single one felt tainted. Had any of it been real? Or was it all just a performance, a way to keep him from questioning too much? His childhood had been a lie. His parents had been thieves, and his past had been rewritten to suit their needs. Beatrice finally spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. "I know this hurts, Thomas. More than anything, I wish I could take away this pain." He turned to her, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "Then why did you wait?" he demanded. "Why didn't you come for me sooner?" The accusation stung, but she took it without flinching. "I tried," she whispered, "but they were powerful, and I was just a desperate mother no one would believe." Her words felt like a punch to his gut. For years, he had unknowingly lived a life built on her suffering. She had fought for him, cried for him, but the world had refused to listen. He had been lost, but she had been left behind. Yearning for a child she never stopped loving. The weight of her pain settled over him, suffocating yet grounding. She wasn't just his mother. She was a survivor of the same betrayal that had broken him. He wanted to run, to disappear into the night and escape the overwhelming truth. But as he looked into Beatrice's eyes, he saw something he had never seen before. Unconditional love, unshaken by time, unbroken by distance. The kind of love that didn't demand anything in return. The kind of love he had never questioned until now. He had been robbed of years with her, but standing here, he realized that he had a choice. Continue running from the truth or start rebuilding from the ruins. Taking a deep breath, he looked at her, not as a stranger, not as a ghost from his past, but as his mother. The pain wouldn't fade overnight, and the anger wouldn't disappear in an instant. But for the first time since the truth was revealed, he allowed himself to take one hesitant step toward the woman who had never stopped waiting for him. Thomas sat alone in his childhood bedroom, except it didn't feel like his anymore. The familiar posters on the walls, the trophies on the shelves, the bed he had slept in for years, they all felt like remnants of someone else's life. He ran his hands over an old photograph, a family vacation he now knew was built on lies. How could the people who claimed to love him steal his entire existence? He clenched his jaw, the weight of abandonment crushing his chest. Beatrice stood outside the door, her heart heavy. She wanted to go to him, to hold him, to make things right. But some wounds couldn't be mended with a touch. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, but she knew she had to let him process the storm inside him. Rushing him wouldn't erase the years of deception. He had to come to her in his own time, in his own way, and she prayed that moment would come before it was too late. The house was suffocating with tension. His adoptive parents remained downstairs, their voices hushed, their guilt evident in every glance they exchanged. They had told themselves for years that their love could justify the theft of a child. But now, standing in the aftermath of their betrayal, they saw the cracks in their own illusion. Thomas had always been theirs, until the truth proved otherwise. Finally, unable to sit in the silence any longer, Thomas walked down the stairs. His eyes burned as they met the faces of the people who had raised him. "How could you?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of years lost. His father tried to speak, but Thomas's anger boiled over. "You had no right. You stole me, you lied to me, and you let me love you while you knew the truth." His mother's sobs filled the room, but Thomas didn't waver. For the first time in his life, he saw them for what they were. Not just parents, but people who had chosen themselves over him. "We did it to protect you," his father insisted, his voice desperate. But the words felt hollow. Protection wasn't built on deception. Love wasn't meant to be a cage. Beatrice stepped forward, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The years of suffering etched on her face, the silent endurance of a mother robbed of her child. It spoke louder than any words could. Thomas turned to her, his chest heaving. He had a choice: clinging to the broken past or stepping into the unknown with the woman who had never stopped waiting for him. For the first time since the revelation, Thomas looked at Beatrice. Not with resentment, not with doubt, but with something raw, something fragile. The first trace of acceptance. The road ahead would be painful, but at this moment he took the first step. He turned his back on the people who had built his life on lies, and walked toward the mother he never knew he had. Thomas sat across from Beatrice in the quiet of a small cafe, the air thick with unsaid words. For the first time, it was just the two of them. No past, no lies, just the undeniable bond of mother and son. But even in the silence, the weight of everything that had happened hung between them. How do you bridge 30 years of separation with mere conversation? He stared at his coffee, unsure of where to begin. Beatrice, on the other hand, had no doubt. She had spent years rehearsing this moment, imagining every possible way their reunion could unfold. Yet now, sitting face to face with the son she had lost, her voice faltered. Would he ever truly forgive her? She traced the rim of her cup, gathering the courage to speak. "I never stopped looking for you, Thomas. Not for a single day." His fingers tightened around the mug, his chest constricting. He wanted to believe her, he really did. But anger still clawed at him, whispering that she had waited too long, that she had let him grow up in a stolen life. "Why didn't you fight harder?" he asked, his voice laced with pain. The accusation burned, but Beatrice met his gaze with unwavering honesty. "Because I was powerless, son. But I never gave up." Thomas exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had spent days drowning in resentment, but now, staring into her sorrow-filled eyes, he saw something different. Not weakness, not abandonment. A mother who had been trapped in an impossible war and lost. The realization hit him hard, unraveling his carefully built walls. Maybe she wasn't the enemy after all. Beatrice reached for his hand but hesitated, afraid of pushing too soon. "I don't expect you to forgive me today," she admitted, "or even tomorrow, but I will wait, however long it takes." Her voice wavered, but the strength in her words was unshakable. Because a mother never stops loving her child, no matter how much time has been stolen. A lump formed in Thomas's throat. Forgiveness wasn't easy, it never was. But for the first time since his world had shattered, he allowed himself to see beyond his own pain. This woman had suffered just as much as he had, maybe even more. He swallowed hard and nodded, barely able to speak. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, "but I'm willing to try." Beatrice's breath hitched, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "That's all I could ever ask for." And for the first time since their reunion, a flicker of hope emerged between them. Not just for forgiveness, but for something neither of them ever thought they'd have again. A future together. Days turned into weeks, and little by little, Thomas and Beatrice began stitching together the fragile threads of their relationship. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was an undeniable effort from both sides. Thomas still struggled with the echoes of the past, but he couldn't ignore the way Beatrice carried her own scars. She had fought battles he had never seen, suffered losses he was only now beginning to understand. And despite everything, she had never stopped loving him. That realization alone made forgiveness feel a little less impossible. Beatriz, on the other hand, was learning to be patient. For years, she had dreamed of holding her son again, but reality was far more complicated than fantasy. She wanted to make up for lost time, but she knew she couldn't rush the healing process. Instead, she focused on being present, offering her support in quiet, steady ways. She cooked for him when he let her. She listened when he spoke. And when he needed space, she gave it without hesitation. One evening, Thomas invited her to dinner, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to. It was the first time he had extended the invitation, and Beatriz fought back tears as she stepped into his home. The walls were lined with memories that weren't hers, but she didn't feel like an outsider. For the first time, she felt like she belonged. Thomas poured her a glass of wine, a small but meaningful gesture. "Tell me about you," he said, and Beatriz knew then that they were finally moving forward. The reconciliation wasn't just between mother and son. It extended beyond them. Thomas had spent so long resenting the family that raised him, but he now saw things with a different lens. His adoptive parents had kept secrets, but they had also loved him in their own way. Forgiveness wasn't just for Beatriz. It was for them too. And so, instead of severing ties, he began rebuilding bridges, acknowledging that love, even when flawed, was still love. It wasn't about erasing the past, but accepting it. Beatriz found herself rediscovering joy in ways she never expected. She had spent decades as a shadow, but now, she was reclaiming her own life. With Thomas by her side, she allowed herself to dream again. She started baking at a small cafe, sharing recipes that had once been meant for a son she never got to raise. And when Thomas showed up one day, unannounced, and told her pastries tasted just like he remembered, she nearly broke down. Because in that moment, she knew she had found her way back to him. Their journey wasn't without setbacks, but that was the nature of healing. It wasn't a straight path. It was a winding road filled with both pain and beauty, but they were walking it together, and that was what mattered. The years they lost could never be recovered, but the years ahead, those were theirs to create. And for the first time, Thomas didn't feel like he was searching for something he had lost, because he had finally found what he was looking for: a mother's love, family, a future. As the sun set over the city, Beatriz and Thomas sat side by side, a quiet understanding passing between them. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic moments, just the simple, profound comfort of knowing that love had won in the end. And that, in itself, was the greatest redemption of all. The morning light streamed through the cafe window, casting a golden glow over the two figures sitting together. For the first time, the silence between them was not filled with tension but with understanding. Thomas still carried doubts, and Beatriz still bore the scars of the past, but something had shifted. The weight of resentment had started to lift, replaced by the fragile possibility of healing. As they stepped outside, the world around them felt different. The city buzzed as usual, people rushing past, but for Thomas, it was as if time had slowed. He had spent so long believing his life had been built on truth, only to discover it had been a carefully constructed illusion. Now he had a choice: to hold onto his anger or to step into the unknown with the woman who had given him life. Beatriz, walking beside him, felt her heart swell with hope. She knew their road would not be easy, but for the first time in decades, she had something she never thought she would again: her son. She stole a glance at Thomas, who seemed lost in thought. Would he let her in? Would he one day call her mom? The thought alone made her chest tighten. Thomas stopped at a street corner, looking at Beatriz with newfound clarity. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted, "but I want to know you. Really know you." His voice was hesitant but sincere. Beatriz felt her throat tighten, nodding with a smile that carried years of silent longing. The days that followed were filled with hesitant conversations and quiet moments of reflection. Thomas asked questions, not all of them easy, but Beatriz answered every one with the honesty he deserved. Piece by piece, their shattered past began to take a new shape, not as something broken, but as something waiting to be rebuilt. A relationship formed not by time but by choice. One evening, as they sat in the small apartment Beatriz now called home, Thomas looked at her and saw not just the woman who had lost him, but the mother who had never stopped fighting for him. "I think I'd like to try your cooking," he said with a small smile. "I hear it's life-changing." Beatrice laughed, a sound so pure it brought tears to her eyes. "Then sit down, son," she said, voice trembling with emotion. "Let me take care of you." The past could never be rewritten, but the future was still theirs to shape. And in that moment, with the scent of home-cooked food filling the air and the promise of second chances lingering between them, mother and son took the first real step towards something neither of them thought they'd have again: a family.